Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everyone on the webinar. Thanks for joining us today. A couple of housekeeping notes to get us started off with. If during the course of the presentation you have any questions, please type your message in the chat box. The moderators will collect up the messages and forward them over to me. Any questions that we don't get the opportunity to answer during our hour together, we'll go ahead and respond to via email. So tell you a little bit about myself to get you started. It's like, why is this guy talking to us? Currently, I'm the Vice President of Supply Chain Management at the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Area Transit Authority. So we manage the rail and bus service for the capital here in the United States. And like most of everyone else, we've also been impacted by COVID-19. Prior to my work here, I spent 27 years in the Army, the U.S. Army, most recently working in the field of healthcare logistics and supply chain management. I enjoyed that work immensely, had the opportunity to travel to many different places around the world, and certainly appreciate the variety and types of supply chains that enable us to do what we do and live the way that we live. 6 to 8 weeks ago, that all changed quite a bit for many of us. And what we found was that the supply chain is pretty interconnected. And when we impact one part of it, we'll get ripple effects throughout many parts of it. And what we found happening was that we pretty much shut the lights off on many aspects of the supply chain. And that has sent crippling effects in some cases through the supply chain. So the question then becomes, how do we get out of this situation that we're in now? There are no easy answers. This is an unprecedented situation in any of our lifetimes. And so we'll talk through some of this, some of the ideas that I've had, and hopefully inspire you to continue to work towards resilience with your own organizations, with your own firms, and even in your own communities, because as we'll see, at the heart of all of this is each and every one of us as an individual. There is no particular magic bullet, and certainly not with the breadth of organizations that are represented on this call today. So this is what we're going to start and cover. We're going to go over COVID-19, the impacts that we're seeing across the world right now, the impacts on supply chains, how we fit into it, the concepts of efficiency and effectiveness. We'll talk about how you can dig out those textbooks and make use of them again, how we've become brittle in a lot of ways, and the impact that that's having on how we approach this. We'll also talk to a little bit about our habits, and then we'll talk a little bit about how we can overcome some of those bad habits as we seek to gain a level of resilience. So the first thing that many of you have seen, and I'm sure that many of you have heard, is that this event is a black swan. From everything that I've heard, everything that I've read, it is not a black swan. And in fact, there are several instances where that's made pretty clear. Probably one of the most compelling folks to tell us that it is not a black swan is Mr. Taleb himself, right? Recently, he's been on several news shows discussing his point of view and why this event is not a black swan. And he has several compelling reasons why he feels that it is not a black swan. First, the situation that there was a pandemic was predictable. It wasn't a situation such as 9/11, wasn't a situation such as the rise of Google as a search engine, or any of the other particular examples that he lays out in some of his books. That said, the idea that this is a black swan, that this is something that's overwhelming, is really important to understand, because at the heart of it all, as you've recognized with your reactions, as you've recognized with your neighbors' reactions and the reactions of the governments, people have many different kinds of reactions to what's going on, right? So with a black swan, oftentimes we feel we don't have any personal control over what's going on with the situation. These things are happening. They're happening without our ability to control them. They're happening without our ability to have taken any precaution against them. We also have no agency, where we can't act on behalf of our organizations, where we can't take actions. And that turns out to not be the case. For those of you who have continued to be able to go to work, to be able to react to this, you recognize that you do have opportunities to make changes. You do have opportunities to engage with the supply chain, with your customers, and with your suppliers. So although there seems to be a lot of emotion surrounding this, it's not as bad as we thought. It's a white swan, and we've got this. If we have even a little bit of understanding about how supply chains work, we certainly understand the huge level of disruption that is going on. We certainly understand the interconnectedness that has been broken in many places, and we understand that it's going to take quite a while to repair. But for all of its complexities, we can certainly see that it is repairable. But again, it will take quite a while, and that's going to be the ultimate challenge. So what are some of the impacts that this has had on the world? One of the big ones that we have all seen, for any of us who have done any international travel, is air traffic demand. Air traffic demand has plummeted. We've also seen the same regarding shipping. We have seen the same impacts regarding the movement of food, which we'll discuss a little bit more as we get further into the presentation. What's one of the big impacts with air traffic? Not only does it impact our mobility and our ability to go conduct business in different parts of the world, oftentimes face-to-face, which is where relationships are first made, but also there's a lot of cargo that moves through the air. With the cessation of a lot of these trips, with the grounding of many of these aircraft, what we're finding is that oftentimes things that were able to move from continent to continent easily are no longer moving. Most recently, here from the United States point of view, the Postal Service has sent out several updates advising shippers that their mail will not be going overseas to Europe via air, but instead will be going by sea. The challenge, of course, there is for people who plan around consistent lead times, such as most of us do, that becomes very problematic. If you also look on the Postal Service's website, you can see there are many, many countries whose postal services are shut down, whose postal services are severely impacted, and when there are a great deal of limitations. Oftentimes we tend to focus on what's local. We tend to focus on what's important to us, but certainly as supply chain professionals, we need to understand how we're interconnected with the rest of the world and the impacts that those have on our own operations. The other impact is that we're finding schools closing. I have some children of my own. They're impacted by the school's closure. I'm currently able to telework and can talk to you from the comfort of my home while my children are in the other room doing their schoolwork. But there are a lot of families, a lot of folks who have to work, who also have to care for young children at home. And oftentimes, if the children are young, that impacts their ability to go to work. If this extends, one of the challenges that will happen is how do we resynchronize starting things up? So again, it was very easy to flip the switch, very easy to have all of these events and operations stop. But what we're finding now is as firms are stretched to the limit with their financial capabilities, that some of them are shutting down for good. Likewise with schools, while schools are not in session face-to-face, we find that families have to accommodate their school children working from home. And again, if you have very young school children, oftentimes that can take away from a parent's time to actually work. Again, if they have the opportunity to telework, and in many situations, that simply isn't an option, creating a very difficult decision for that mom or dad, or for that family as a whole, to understand who will care for the children and who will go to work. Looking forward, when we do start to have businesses open up again, when we do start to have companies and governments saying we are now open for business, the childcare issue remains if there's a lack of synchronization. This synchronization will be key, and health and childcare rather is one key area, not the only area, but certainly one of the more important ones, as these are very personal decisions regarding who will care for a family's child. Likewise, if we move over to the right side of the slide, we're also seeing the merchandise trade values have plummeted greatly over the past couple of months. Also, another interconnectedness in that if trade drops, if merchandise is not being purchased, we also limit the flow of money, and we limit the opportunities for employees to actually have work. And this goes back to, are companies able to maintain their status as a going concern? Are companies able to manufacture the items that are needed and desired? Here in the Washington, D.C. area, and I'm sure in many areas around the world, one of the things that we're seeing is restaurants. Restaurants have been hard hit, and although in many cases they've been allowed to continue to conduct business doing takeout or delivery, we're starting to see many high-end restaurants, also many family restaurants, who have said that they've reached the end of their financial capabilities to remain open and are closing for good. Every time one of those stories hits the news, we realize that there are not only employees who are impacted by that, but the subsequent supply chains. And we know, as we've seen over the past few weeks, that the institutional supply chain that supplies restaurants and schools and so on is very different than the commercial supply chain that provides food to grocery stores and bodegas and so on. So each one of these that closes is going to have a ripple effect. The challenge is understanding how great the ripple effect will be and what the ultimate outcome will be. One of the challenges is having to remain flexible with how we view the future. Unfortunately, the future keeps changing on almost a daily basis. A lot of this depends on, again, another level of complexity, with governments feeling safe to allow people to go back to work, and with the employees themselves and the potential customers themselves feeling safe going back into these businesses and spending their money. So some of the recent great impacts that we've seen on April 1st, Premier Inc. conducted a survey and regarding people feeling safe. They anticipate perhaps a 17-time surge in supply demand as people who are ill are hospitalized, as people who are ill and test positive continue to go seek medical care. That's a great challenge for the healthcare supply chain. As many of you know, that would be a challenge for any supply chain to weather a 17 times surge. Something that we generally don't think of, something that we certainly don't stress test our supply chains on, even though it would make sense, it would seem, even if it was a simulation or a tabletop exercise. Oftentimes in the past, what we found is that taking those precautions to do that kind of stress test isn't something that's supported. Unfortunately, we're seeing now, we're having to go through this individually, and oftentimes many companies, except those who perhaps were the more enlightened and were able to take that proactive step, very few firms understand what the true impact is. We've seen stories of firms who don't know who their suppliers are beyond their first-tier distributor. And when asked, certainly early on in this pandemic, do we have any key suppliers in areas that are impacted by COVID-19? The answer oftentimes was, we just don't know. I would argue that in the future, this is an area that should be looked at more closely, that of mapping our supply chains, that of understanding where our key suppliers are, and also the concept of running a very lean operation. Although operationally that has been it's been the way that a lot of organizations have wanted to go, simply because of the cost savings. Here we are. What else have we seen? We talked about the disruptions to the international postal supply chain. Now, the unique part of the postal supply chains is that oftentimes they will deliver to any address in a country. Right? That's part of what they do. Unlike other carriers here in the United States, such as a UPS or a FedEx, there is no way to get a door-to-door delivery of a small letter for the same price that the Postal Service is able to do that. It's a great benefit. However, with volumes down, it puts greater stress on these vital operations to be able to conduct their business in an effective and timely manner. The flip side, of course, is customs clearances. This has been complicated by the surge in demand, certainly in some very popular areas where merchandise is coming out of, such as China, with a lot of healthcare material flowing out of China, and also recent trade decisions made by different governments. These trade decisions, these tariffs, have caused great complications, in addition to the current stresses to the supply chains that we're seeing now. Recently, this was as of last week, but again, we had another jobs report come out here in the United States where we have great stress on the workforce. All right, so for a lot of people, this is not simply a complexity of the supply chain. It's not simply a disruption to the supply chain. It's a disruption to their personal lives, and this disruption is in a way that is very personal to many of us. Right. In this case, I believe in the United States, we've now had first-time unemployment claims of over 30 million, and they're anticipating an unemployment rate of at least 17%, which surpasses the unemployment rate we had during the Great Depression. Obviously, a lot of impacts to people in their personal lives. So, other areas that we're seeing COVID-19, we're seeing it in the rice supply chain in Southeast Asia. Australia, many of those countries there are feeling the impact as demand has shifted. We're seeing it with empty store shelves. Famously here in the United States, the run on toilet paper. We've also seen it with flour, and the good thing is it allows us to talk to our friends and neighbors about the bullwhip effect and the different kinds of supply chains that exist between both, again, institutional supply chains and commercial supply chains. But I don't know that that provides a whole lot of comfort to folks when they're having those discussions and they're going to the store and they're looking for these things. Oftentimes here in the United States, especially in the Northeast, where I come from, we'll see a run on toilet paper and milk and eggs right before a snowstorm. Those are generally short-lived events, and then things get back to normal. What we're seeing here is very unusual in terms of the demand for toilet paper, and it seems to be sustained as the supply chain works to try to correct itself. For those of you who aren't familiar with the bullwhip effect, that's the effect of unscheduled and unanticipated buying sending shockwaves through the rest of the several tiers of the supply chain back to the manufacturer, who then has to adjust. Oftentimes, they're able to relatively quickly, and in this case, they have been able to supply the product, but it's the consumer demand that continues to be more severe. So oftentimes, product will show up at a store, there's some panic buying, the shelves are empty, the next customer goes in and sees that the shelves are empty, and it becomes an emotional event for them. Obviously a great challenge for the supply chain to try to overcome. And at the other end, there are quite simply capacity issues. And if we look at what the earlier slide was talking about for healthcare demand, with a 17 times increase that can be very challenging for any organization to increase their output. Other areas that we're seeing impacts, again, as we go back to the unemployment rate, we see that food banks have been hit with several times the demand that they normally go through. Oftentimes, as you know, food banks receive a lot of supplies or a lot of their products from grocery stores. So likewise, as grocery stores are impacted, consumers are buying more canned goods, more shelf-stable products. There's less available for food banks, further exacerbating the situation, and again, putting pressure on those who may be unemployed and who may be food insecure. And as you can see, it becomes a ripple effect in terms of how this is managed. And it does impact everywhere in the world. Picture that came up now is food stalls in India, where the food sellers are waiting to sell fresh fruits and vegetables. But even in some of the most populous parts of the world, there's still a great deal of concern about people getting together in large groups, people getting together and perhaps becoming infected. And these gentlemen, although one has a face covering and is not wearing it, the other one doesn't seem to have one at all. The different behaviors that we have are very concerning. This is a very unique situation for us to be in. And again, how we approach this as individuals, we'll say, I believe, is key to how we get around this. So what's one of the things that we need to do? Well, all of us in all of our firms, we have a strategy. And we had a strategy 8 weeks ago. My company, we had plans, we had regular meetings, we had goals, we had metrics and KPIs that we were working towards, we had synergies that we were trying to develop. And then COVID-19 came along. For us, that created a whole bunch of new realities in our marketplace. I work for a transit system, so our marketplace realities were that people weren't going to work. There were no riders. We had employees that we needed to safeguard. So we had to come up with a different way of scheduling folks. Across the world, there are many different kinds of realities as well. If you're someone who sells new cars, that becomes problematic as fewer people need cars, as we're oftentimes directed to remain at home. We're seeing a lot of these new realities, again, across a lot of different kinds of marketplaces. Oftentimes, these realities will shift frequently. Yesterday, there was news of China relaxing some of its tariff restrictions on 25 different items to include some medical supplies as well as some chemicals. Some of those chemicals are used to make isopropyl alcohol, which is a key ingredient in hand sanitizer. That was yesterday. If someone can predict what will happen on Friday, well, that would be ideal. However, very few of us are in that situation. Very few of us have that capability. So what we do is we inherit this increasing amount of risk. We have to make sure that we're staying locked in with what's going on in the marketplaces that are important to us, both upstream with our customers as well as downstream with our key suppliers. Again, as this impacts more and more businesses, not only is it incumbent on us to understand our key suppliers, which oftentimes many of us didn't take the time to develop those relationships for whatever reason, but also our supplier's supplier, as well as their health and well-being financially and as a going concern. Right, so these realities are unpredictable oftentimes. Right, we have seen impacts lately from oil, from food production. We have seen impacts from tariffs. We have seen impacts on shipping being taken out of service. We've seen impacts from aircraft being taken out of service. We've seen here in the United States, several trucking companies have closed their doors in the past 8 weeks as well. So a lot of this is shifting in ways that, again, 8 weeks ago, we would not have begun to imagine this. So we have to remain flexible. Again, your previous strategy may still be okay, but you also need to take the time to seriously reassess if that's the correct strategy as you move forward. And oftentimes, as a member of the supply chain, we are one small part of the overarching strategy of a firm, but you need to be aware that these conversations need to continue to happen. If you are going to remain a going concern, is there a way that the organization has to modify what it does, who its customers are, and how can you best support that in your role in the supply chain? So we have many enablers in the supply chain, as we've seen over the years. Technology is there. Technology has been a great enabler for us. Those of you who get to use an ERP understand the value of the power that a well-designed and well-run ERP can bring. You know and hopefully appreciate the ability to conduct a good forecast and to be able to predict with some degree of certainty what the future will hold. Those of you, again, as I mentioned earlier, who have taken the time to map out your supply chain, have the opportunities, especially with some of the larger companies who have these resources, to understand how impacts to the environment, how impacts to your suppliers can impact your ability to produce and manufacture. On the internal side, sales and operations planning, being able to sit down with your colleagues and discuss sales, production capabilities over the next 2, 6, 9 months is very valuable. We know that plans can be in place with short lead times. We know that the plan that's developed will come together. I think any of us currently, except for those industries where there's a high demand for their products that they are pretty sure will last for a while. For instance, people who make disinfectant, people who make toilet paper, certainly certain food items, they're pretty sure that there's going to be a steady and continuing demand. But for others that we thought were sure things, a lot of that has changed quite drastically now. So how do we manage all of this? Because ultimately, in all of these books, there is no chapter on the pandemic. There is no chapter on how to model during a pandemic. And if so, is it capable of modeling during this pandemic? And as we've seen, there are so many variables. Oftentimes they change so quickly that it would be nearly impossible to build a model in time to actually react to it. So what do we do? How do we navigate with new information coming in almost every day? And that's one of the great challenges I believe that most all of us have, and that we will continue to have for the foreseeable future. It would be nice to be able to put everything into a model. It would be nice to be able to put all of the historical sales data into our ERP and have some sort of a forecast or a predictive answer or even a prescriptive answer come out the other end. Unfortunately, I don't believe that we're anywhere near that right now. So one of the things with new information that Warren Buffett reminds us is that oftentimes as humans, it really doesn't matter. Even if we get all sorts of new information, what we thought was going to happen before is what we will continue to take with us into the future. The challenge with that is that we're in such an unprecedented time that this is such a challenging situation to be in that that kind of reality will not work for this particular situation. Now, we've talked about the impacts. So what are some of those things that could happen? Well, your initiatives that you've had in place previously might need to be put on hold. Whatever you had planned during that your weekly business meeting, the second week of January, you may have to put on hold for a while as we move from the previous strategy to being able to mitigate the impacts of COVID-19, being able to mitigate the impacts on our financial bottom line, and being able to mitigate the impacts in our own personal lives. So there might have been some of you who are working on green initiatives. Very popular these days as we explore opportunities to reduce our carbon footprint. We have that conversation with several colleagues. For the past 6 to 8 weeks, that has not been a conversation that we have been having. Many companies have conversations surrounding sustainability, also a very laudable goal in terms of recycling, reducing our footprint, dealing with plastics, moving more into a circular economy where we look to reduce, reuse, recycle. However, a lot of that has been abandoned or, again, put on hold while we have a full court press to respond to the activities that we need. Glove usage has gone through the roof. Obviously not a very green and not a very sustainable option. However, it's the one that will help to mitigate the situation that we're in. AI and machine learning, an area that I'm particularly fond of. I think that the opportunities to incorporate machine learning into our supply chains, into understanding our stock levels, into being able to do edge computing. In our case, we do a lot with supporting maintenance operations, being able to understand much earlier than we ever could before when a part or a subcomponent or an asset is going to need repairs. I think is a great opportunity and one that can be brought forward using machine learning and AI. However, given the kinds of data that AI and machine learning need right now, that becomes problematic, as we'll talk about here in a few minutes. And also capital investments, right? There's a lot of cost with responding to COVID-19. For those firms who aren't able to receive any federal funding for that response, where does the money come from? A lot of firms want to continue to be able to pay their employees. A lot of firms want to be able to continue to pay their expenses. It could be rent or mortgage, utility bills, and so on. And one of the areas that may be ripe to look for money is in capital investments, where that will be put off into the future, except for the most severe ones. Again, these are the impacts, and your previous strategy may still be okay, but you must take the time to sit down and reassess that strategy. So one of the things that I thought this was a very great chart that MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics put together, and you can replace sustainability with green, with AI, ML, and see how in 2019, a lot of our firms were moving forward. We were working with our partners. We were getting these efforts recognized as a good investment of our time, as a good investment of our money. And then 2020 hit, right? So we're in a mitigation phase. We're responding. And almost every day, there's new information that's coming out. Here in the United States, there's new guidance from the Centers for Disease Control. Worldwide, there may be differing guidance from the World Health Organization and local health agencies, all the way down to the local level. And excuse me, here in the United States, we have that as well, where oftentimes the advice that we're receiving can be fragmented. So what do we do? Well, we're here in 2020. We're working through these challenges as they pop up, one at a time, but also we need to keep an eye on the future. So what does 2021 look like? There are two ways that we can do this. One is we can assume that the way things existed in January is the way that we want to build them again once we come out of this. But given all of the things that we've discussed, is that really possible? Given all of the changes that you know are going on with your supply chains, given all of the changes you know are going on with your customers, is that a reality as we move into the recovery phase of this? Transportation has been disrupted. The ability to manufacture items has been disrupted. The ability to obtain raw materials has been disrupted. And all of those linkages will have to be recreated. So when I talk about going back and reconsidering what your strategy is, it's not to say that you have to change, but you have to think about it. That's definitely the case. Periodically in the business literature and the business journals, you'll see stories of entrepreneurs, small businesses who are looking at the way that their operations used to be realizing that that just isn't feasible anymore. And although it does have ripple effects to their suppliers, they have to redesign themselves in order to maintain some sort of a business. So we're going to see a lot of changes. That redesign portion is going to be critical, and having a flexible mindset is going to be critical as well. And then MIT anticipates in 2022 and beyond that we rediscover what that purpose is for our business being a going concern, and then we continue to move into the future. And again, we're growing again, we're moving upwards again. So, but we're human as we're going through all of this, and so we make decisions, right? And it's a pandemic, and it's impactful. It's hard to go through newspapers these days without every story being about the pandemic. Certainly difficult if you're a sports fan, because the sports page is almost non-existent, and seasons which should have begun have not begun. There are plans for seasons coming up which are being put on hold or redesigned almost wholesale, it seems. So, but as humans, we feel that there's a great loss. And what we know when it comes to decision making is that the impact of feeling a great loss is key. So several years ago, researchers Kahneman and Tversky worked on loss aversion, and they recognized that when we're faced with a large loss versus a small gain, and I think we could all agree that if we had to trade a large loss for a small gain, we would go after the small gain. But human nature says that we focus more on the large losses. And in this environment, pretty much all of the news that you see is of some sort of a loss, some sort of a change, some sort of a negative. And there really aren't enough good news stories coming out of this about how on an individual level, on a corporate level, we are winning and we are making strides. And I think as we remain in the throes of this, because I think we're still early days, that becomes a challenge for us as people. And one of the things that I like to remind people that I talk to and my students is that at the end of the day, this is a supply chain that's run by people. And it's real people with real emotions and real concerns and real fears. So we can't discount that. It can't be, well, if I apply this, then everything will run like machinery. Yes, there's a time that the machinery will go manufacture the product the way that the engineers have designed it. It will get packaged, labeled, and shipped. It will all be automatic, and it will be replicable. However, where we're at now, as it's humans deciding who's going to move forward, as it's humans deciding what financial risks to take, we need to be cognizant of that. So this focus on loss, again, as we talked about earlier, is amplified by the near constant change of the value of something, right? So a good case in point that everybody will get is the value of a face mask. I know before the pandemic hit, we were paying 80 cents a piece or so for our N95 NIOSH approved face masks, which was pretty much a gold standard for respirators here in the United States. And we've seen stories now of the value of it, if you will, if someone's willing to pay that, where these can cost $3, $4, $6 each, and their provenance is unknown, and in some cases unknowable. We've seen the value of shipping. Shipping costs have gone up both for sea and for air. Processing, the value of processing an unemployment claim, right? While people are waiting, and at least here in the United States, we had some old tech that was in place. Again, it creates a lot of uncertainty, right? So given the situation with us as humans, we're getting a lot more of the downside framing, and we may tend to be more risk averse and sort of want to pull back and not want to look forward into how we can change and how we can redesign things to mitigate the risks that we're facing. But like I said earlier, we've got artificial intelligence and machine learning, right? So those should be great enablers, right? We can put in a lot of data. We can gain a lot of insight. We've seen how, in a lot of cases, they are able to support us in what we do and to make what we do better. Tech enables us to be more efficient. I would not say that we need to downplay the capabilities of AI, machine learning, and so on at this point. But I think that we need to also apply our ability to see into complex situations as part of our resiliency when we're using this information, when we're using the insights that are gained through artificial intelligence and machine learning. Again, the data that we're receiving right now is extremely variable. There are unexpected stockouts. There are unanticipated demands. But without us being able to add that context in this rapidly shifting environment, it's going to be problematic for AI and machine learning to understand that. Because oftentimes, if you're familiar with how the process works, thousands and thousands or even millions of data points have to be fed in for the AI algorithm to understand what it's seeing. And although we do get eventually to the point of some self-learning algorithms out there, those require, again, even larger amount of information. And oftentimes at this rate and at this point in their development, they're oftentimes out of reach of some of the smaller, medium-sized enterprises that are out there. So what's shifting? Well, the strategic environment is shifting. Are we going to be in this business any longer? What do the regulations say? Will there be tariffs? Will there be more border crossings? Will there be hoops that my drivers have to get through in order to cross a border somewhere, which could delay a shipment? What's the marketplace like? Again, are my suppliers still there? More importantly, is my customer still there? And are they still needing what I'm providing in the same quantity that they used to? Workplace disruptions. We're seeing that here in the United States with meatpacking industries, where because of the nature of the work and the closeness of people, oftentimes when one person gets sick, it spreads quickly through the workforce. And now we have great disruptions in the ability to provide, in this case, protein to the population. So that can change rapidly over the course of a day. And that can have great impact, as we've seen, where farmers and meat producers are having to abandon crops, are having to abandon livestock. And again, with this material that requires a long lead time, whether it's to go through the animal husbandry process for livestock, or to plant a crop, getting the seed in early, and so on. Again, all of this has changed over the last 8 weeks. And if you were to sit and think, what should that farmer plant today to be ready to harvest in 12 weeks? What would that answer be? Will that farmer be healthy to harvest it at that time? Will the marketplace buy it at a price where he's actually able to make money? Will the regulations be in place that if he can't sell it locally, that's allowed to be sold overseas at a profit? Right? So we're humans in the supply chain, but we need to change the culture in order to get past this. And for a lot of folks, I believe that will be one of the greatest challenges. Right? As the noted business thinker Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So we've talked previously about strategy. However, for those of you who know, because you've been through this, you can have a fantastic plan. And if the culture of the organization is not able to engage it and believe it and live it, your strategy becomes so many words on a PowerPoint slide or so many pages in a brand new document. So AI and ML, yeah, they've got their place. However, it's very difficult for them to learn the lessons that they need to learn because of the way that they're structured, even given the millions of data points. Because right now we're struggling with getting consistent data that can be applied time and again in a way that will allow AI and ML to function. Now, when all of these data points from this pandemic are put in, that will help them, this AI and ML, for future disruptions. And I'm looking forward to being able to look back on these days and analyze that data. However, while we're in the middle of it, it is less helpful. Again, these databases are being filled with data in a highly variable environment that the learning algorithms would find very challenging to understand. Again, I'm not saying that we have to abandon tech, but we do need to apply the extra added layer of human understanding on top of that. So tech absolutely affects our efficiency. We've benefited greatly from automation and data crunching over the years, but how we're going to be effective as we move through this pandemic will be enabled by our understanding, by our careful synthesis, and our analysis of the environment that we're working through, and we can't separate them. We can't default to, well, the ERP said we need to do that. Again, underlying the data that you've been getting in over the past weeks and months may be problematic depending on the industry that you're in, and you need to take a close look at that. But what do we get if we're able to balance efficiency and this effectiveness with human understanding? You get the competitive advantage. If your competitor is not able to understand how to move forward in this environment, then definitely you'll get the leg up. So again, AI and ML are great. However, as they're being fed, as they're learning right now, it will be great data for reflection in the future. However, there's a lot of uncertainty and risk in the data that if it's not understood, because oftentimes people like what comes out of what they would call a black box, it will, I believe it will lead you in directions that will be problematic. So what do we do? Well, I would say dust off your textbooks. And going back to the human element, we need to be able to provide some leadership through all of this, because leadership through uncertainty is one of the things that will hold everyone together. For those of you who have been through change management, I would definitely recommend going back and looking about how do you change in a way that's helpful? How do you change in a way that allows people to follow and where new leaders can emerge as well? I would recommend that you relook your supply chain architecture and structure. This is a great opportunity for doing that. Perhaps what you'll find is that the way that things were structured in January will continue to be fine in the future. But what you may find as well is that this is an opportunity for you to restructure it. Where will it settle? That's difficult to say. Again, that goes back to the variation that we talked about earlier. So we talked about business strategy earlier. Do you need to align your supply chain with this new business strategy? That would be something to consider as well, right? And with that new strategy, are there new metrics and KPIs that you need? There are quite a few out there. There are books and books that have been written on metrics and KPIs. But as we shift, do you need to change what those are at the same time in order to understand if you're executing this new strategy appropriately? And what are the innovative opportunities out there? I believe it's great that you're actually participating in this webinar. I've done the same thing myself because there are a lot of good news stories out there. There are a lot of ways that other companies are adjusting to this, and there are a lot of innovators out there. So definitely you need to be able to plug into those ideas and measure and weigh which ones work for you. We talked about earlier, injecting that human element. And also revisit your the projects that you put on hold, whether it's sustainability or green initiatives and so on, as we, again, look beyond 2020 to 2021 and 2022, recovery and change. So why are we this brittle? Why have we hit the wall as hard as we have in so many ways? Because oftentimes companies are complex. We try to adapt, but as those of you who have seen who have been in this business for a while, oftentimes that can be slow to happen. We have both human and technical elements that are involved with this, and those complexities and interdependencies between humans and technology is where we get brittleness. We get systems that are locked in place. We get systems that we can't change, And when we want to have a change, we find that it's immovable. And what's happened with the pandemic is that the immovable has been hit so hard that in many instances it's shattered. We've been pushed to the edge in many ways, and at the edge, just like with the pane of glass, at the edge is where things are more brittle, and you can start to flake off pieces. Right. The pandemic has pushed us to multiple boundaries almost at the same time, which is challenging. We have workplace issues, we have financial issues, we have supply chain issues. All of these have challenges, and if you take any one of those legs of the stool out, you risk a disaster. Right? Our orders, they've dried up. Our workers are in quarantine. Liquidity, not sure, because the orders have gone away. Are suppliers and customers going to be there in 2 months' time, 8 months' time, 1 year's time? And how do you plan for their being there or their not being there? Stresses in our own personal lives can't be ignored, right? We are people who are going through this. And if we take that to work, if we don't seek the help that we need through employee assistance programs, that is just as much a part of resilience as anything else, right? And ultimately, will our own firm be around in 3 months, 8 months, or a year? There are all of these challenges that we have to overcome. One of the things that we do in that case is we revert back to habits. So for those of you who are familiar with the story of the Sirens from Greek mythology, they would sing songs to the sailors as they went by. The sailors would lose sight of what they were doing because everything seemed so wonderful. They would wind up crashing on the shore and dying. And our habits are comfortable, right? It's very easy to say, well, we've done this before. Let's do it again when this is all over and everything will be okay because we're comfortable with it. It's an irresistible opportunity to say, if I just go back to the way things were, everything will be great and everything will open up again. And I think that may be unrealistic thinking. And that habit keeps us from seeing that danger, right? So the Sirens were singing this song. It was beautiful. It enraptured the sailors, and they couldn't see the danger that was truly there as they headed towards the rocks. But Odysseus tied himself to the ship's mast, and he sailed past the Sirens. So he saw what his true goal was. He had adjusted his strategy, and he wasn't going to be subject to the change of that. And Jason had Orpheus play the lyre to drown out the siren song. So Jason again had his goal, and he was able to set the conditions where he wasn't subject to the siren's song. So, question you have to ask yourself then is, what will you do? Will you stay the course? Will you listen to your own tune? Again, that's something that each of you will have to decide for yourself. One way, again, digging out old texts, would be to revisit something like the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, right? Walks you through a very systematic way, which can be a level of comfort, but it may be something that you haven't revisited in a while in terms of organizing how you're going to change and how you're going to react to this in the future. So how do we do that mentally, right? So came across this term of mentation, which is a neuroscience term, but I thought it really worked well here, right? So our goal is resilience, right? We want our supply chain to be resilient. We know that a strategy developed by humans will enable that for us. And as a human, the big part of doing that is our brain, right? However, most of the day, our brains are thinking about other things, these spontaneous thoughts that come into our minds. And you do that, I do that as well, and it's a challenge that we have to overcome. But when it's overcome by distressing thoughts, right, going back to all of the negative information in the news, it's harder for us to become resilient because when we're thinking about things that are negative, we don't do as well on whatever our present task is. If our present task is, how do we get to 2021? How do we get to 2022? That becomes a problem. If we're looking again at the positives of what the increased payoff is of a well-structured new strategy, of a well-structured framework for the future, then that actually enhances our task performance. And high personal value information In this case, a reward could be a financial reward or some sort of other award or recognition has been found to be very helpful in these situations, right? So this mentation thing, something that we can start to look at. Some might call it mindfulness. Some might consider it something along the lines of meditation, but it's allowing your mind to look in a positive way as to what the future can hold, right? So one of those things that you need to do is look for your new strategy, whatever that might be. And your new strategy may simply be a small modification of the old strategy, and that's fine. But then also take the time to take care of yourself. Oftentimes many of us are, well, we've got to work, we've got to solve this, there's lots of things to do. I've got to work 8, 10, 12, 14 hours every day until I get over this. But what the science tells us is that oftentimes the self-care, right? I don't want this to sound like a self-help session, but again, if we're going to design new strategies, we're going to design that with our minds, with our intelligence. Those are things that have to be cared for, and I think they're at the very root of any resilience that's out there. I'd encourage you to continue as we go through the next few weeks to seek out training events, webinars such as this, ideas where you get innovative thoughts that you're able to cultivate and add value to the changes that your organization is going through, and go back to the basics. There's a lot of good reasons that the basics are there. There's a lot of good reasons that they appear in multiple textbooks because they've stood the test of time, and that makes them very valuable. And ultimately, as a leader, going back to the very beginning where we talked about change management, take that responsibility to drive the solution for your firm by showing them, hey, this is how supply chain can support the ideas that you have. How long is that going to take, though, right? That's when will this pandemic end? Well, some folks over at Boston Consulting did an analysis, again, a recent analysis based on the best that we know, and this is one way that they've structured it. May not be the answer for everyone. Again, every consulting firm, every think tank, a lot of smart folks are working on this constantly. So again, I would consider, or I would encourage you to find what those are, read through them. Again, see how they mesh with your current business's strategy. All right, well, once again, I appreciate everybody's time. I know an hour of your day is very valuable, so I appreciate that you spent it with us. There are no questions that came in, so we'll go ahead and wind down this session. Again, I wish you all the best as you move through this challenging time. And have a great rest of your day, again, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much.